It works? Great. Welcome to our panel. We are going to talk about leveraging technology in publishing to solve the reproducibility crisis. And my name is Moshe Pritzker. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Jove, a video publisher. Elizabeth Ketterman is the librarian from East Carolina University. John Inglis is a publisher from Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory Press. And Elizabeth Ernst is the CEO of Science Exchange Company. So I'll start with the definition of reproducibility, what it is. So this is a typical example of when your experiment is not reproducible. And here how it works. Here the studies, original studies in Science magazine, one of the top scientific journals in the world. And that specific study in 2010 found that addition of a specific molecule, a specific peptide, make cancers to absorb drugs much faster. And so they have done few experiments, as you can see here on the chart, and they found that that black tall bar shows that with adding that molecule helps in treatment of cancer almost 7-fold. Beautiful example. Dream of every biologist, dream of every scientist in the world. I myself worked a lot of years in the lab, did my PhD in biology. So every time you get something like that, you say, yay, right? The only thing that other people will build on your work. Other people will read that article, and they will try to repeat your experiment. Why would they do it? Because for them, this is the only way to learn the technology, right? As a scientist, you constantly learn technologies developed by other scientists in order to advance with your own work. How do you do it? You read this article, and you have to reproduce it with your own hands in your lab, because this is the only way to learn technology. So you try to do it. Sorry, oops. And these people in 2017, actually one of them is Elizabeth, they tried to reproduce this article through Cancer Reproducibility Project after a lot of rumors and data that we have reproducibility crisis. And they were not able, they were not able to reproduce this result, despite having trained scientists on their staff, despite trying to repeat this experiment in multiple ways. So this is what we call lack of reproducibility. So reproducibility is an ability to repeat an experiment. So why scientists need reproducibility? Well, as I told you, for them, this is the only way to learn new technology. So here you see a typical life cycle of academic researcher, so work cycle. So as a researcher, you do new research. Once you get results, you publish them. Other researchers are supposed to learn it in order to learn the technology. If this part doesn't work, then the whole thing doesn't work. And then we have a problem. No reproducibility, no productive research. So reproducibility crisis is real, it's big. And actually today we have much more data than before. So when I was doing my PhD, it was all anecdotal. Yeah, that's why science is difficult. That's why we all suffer here. That's why our experiments don't work. Well, maybe you should do it better. But then, in 2012, two companies, one of them Bayer in Germany, and another one is Amgen in California, came up with a systematic study where they had a group of researchers in each of those companies. Each of them got 50, 60 articles published in top research journals in different fields, and they tried to reproduce them. So Bayer was able to get 21% replication rate, and Amgen got 11% of replication rate. That means 60 to 90% of published science articles are not reproducible. This is a hair-raising number, right? We believe in science because it is reproducible. If I state a scientific fact found through experiment, another scientist is supposed to get the same, to confirm this fact. If they are not able to confirm this fact, it's not science. So it's a huge philosophical foundation problem for science and for the society. But it also means a lot of money. So, for example, in NIH only, the funding given to researchers through NIH, National Institute of Health, through grants, it's about 40 billion per year. If 60 to 90% of this is not reproducible, our loss comes to 24 to 36 billion per year. And this is all good taxpayer money. Taxpayer gives the money to the scientists, to science, to government. Government distributes the grants, but only part of this is working, and small part of it. So impact for society is a delay in development of new medicine and low return on investment. For institutions, it means poor productivity. For scientists, it oftentimes means broken career. You came to science to solve a problem of the humanity, to cure cancer, to develop new stem cell therapy, and what do you do instead? Instead, you reinvent the wheel. Most of the time, you're busy trying to repeat experiments published by other people because you cannot advance without them. And this is how you spend most of your PhD, wasting money of your institution and your time. So current ideas to solve the reproducibility crisis. So after that 2012 studies, we had a lot of discussion, a lot of debate, and few ideas merged as a solution. So one of them, more data preservation. Behind this idea is that we don't save all the data after each study, and so oftentimes study is not reproducible because of this. Another one, scientists don't know statistics enough, so they cannot distinguish between true results and not true results, and then report wrong results. Another one, well, scientists are constantly busy in publishing, publish or perish. This is in order to distinguish themselves in their community and get more grant money. And that publish and perish phenomenon makes them to publish not so verified results. And another one, which I personally believe, that we need to improve publication of research methods. And I believe that this is a main solution. And why do I say so? I'll simply go through the data preservation statistics. You saw the first slide, right? Let's go here. Here, right? So this is the result. When you have a result like that, you don't need statistics. You don't need any data. Your data is here. You have 7-fold difference between one to another sample. That's a fact that you need to know. And you don't need any more than that. And this is still not reproducible. So what I'm trying to say, today we cannot reproduce even simple experiments, even single data point experiments. So more data preservation or more training in statistics, in my opinion, are not going to solve this problem. What we need to know, to do better knowledge transfer on how to. And we in Jove do it through video. Other people may come with other methods. But again, I think that's the solution in research methods. And again, the list of our panelists, some of them may not agree with me. So we are going to hear from them now. If each of you can introduce yourself and tell us what institution you represent and why you're here. Elizabeth, please.
Sure. So I'm Beth Ketterman. I'm the interim director at the Lapis Health Sciences Library at East Carolina University. And I'm here today to talk about the librarian's role in helping mitigate the reproducibility crisis. And I'll talk a little bit about how my university has aspirations to become an R1 or highest research producing university within the Carnegie classification system. And so how I think the librarians at my school can play a part in helping us expand our research enterprise and helping with the reproducibility issues is a part of that.
John.
I'm John Ingalls, and I'm from Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in New York. You may not have come across it. It's 126 years old, a research institution that was part of the cradle of the development of human genetics in the early part of the 20th century and part of the birth of molecular biology in the middle of that century. So in addition to being a research institution, for 80 of those years, it has been a place that has trained scientists, particularly in how to do various kinds of technologies in cell and molecular biology. That means partly people physically going there to have very intense experiences under the tutelage of people who are experts in these technologies. And that process continues. The part of the spin-off of that activity was the development by the laboratory in the 70s and 80s of a series of laboratory manuals which captured exactly in precise detail how to do these technologies. And that was a major part of spreading, for example, recombinant DNA technology through the world from courses that began with small numbers of experts at Cold Spring Harbor. That series of manuals has evolved into a journal called Cold Spring Harbor Protocols, which is one of 8 journals that we publish as a press. My other hat at the lab is to be the co-founder of the Preprint service bioRxiv, which is 3 years old and growing rapidly. And I can talk a bit about how that may or may not be helping the reproducibility issue.
And Elizabeth.
Great. So I'm the CEO of Science Exchange, and I'm actually a cancer biologist by training. So I was a scientist for many years before starting Science Exchange. And relative to this particular issue, Science Exchange has actually run most of the published replication studies that look at rates of reproducibility.
Beth, I think libraries have a central role in solving reproducibility crisis. I say that because, well, libraries practically serve as a filter at any institution. Libraries are responsible for purchase of material and resources, and then whatever solutions we will have for reproducibility crisis, they will probably cost some money, and libraries will practically decide whether they are available at the institution or not. And at the same time, you have kind of an education role at your institution as a source of information. So can you tell us about the latest initiatives you have at your library to solve the reproducibility problem?
Sure. So I can talk about a specific project we're working on right now. And as I said in my introduction, we have this aspiration to be a higher producing research university at East Carolina. One of the ways the librarians are trying to integrate themselves into the research process is by implementing the open science framework as we work with our researchers. And just before I left for this conference, we found out we got an intramural grant from our university to do just that as a sort of pilot project at ECU. So we're working with one of our physical therapy faculty who is the head of our human movement analysis laboratory, and he's generating a lot of data based on human exercise. And the librarians are working with him to archive that data in a very discoverable way. We've trained his graduate assistants in using the open science framework, which will collect and archive the data. And the librarians are also using some of the add-ons from the OSF, including Mendeley and Dataverse, in order to sort of make that data as robust as possible, including the citations that the researcher is using to base his research on. And so we're really excited about that project. It's also collaborative. We are a health sciences library that reports separately from our academic library. So the data librarian is actually based at the academic library. The liaison librarian who knows PT and elements of human analysis research is based in our library. So they're working together to do this. And I think it's a really effective model for librarians to not just help with making that data as discoverable as possible, which will hopefully help with reproducibility issues, but also integrate ourselves into the research process in a way that really adds value to the university. So yeah, open science framework, we're a big fan of it.
I see.
Yeah.
So you work on practically you increasing data preservation at your institution.
That's right.
Do you think that's the method that you will take in the future to deal with the reproducibility problem, or you think you envision other solutions for your institution?
Well, so you mentioned collecting information. That's a traditional service of libraries, and I think we will continue to be on the lookout for innovative ways that publishers are exploring making data and methods in particular available in the most effectively communicated way. And I promise you this was not intended to be a commercial for Joe, for my part, but we are a huge fan of that concept of using videos to communicate experimentation. We were an early adopter of Jove, and our faculty really, really love it. The peer-reviewed aspect of video communications is, I think, incredibly critical to their success in reproducibility. So we'll continue to monitor the landscape of publishing and, I guess, in a way, reward those publishers that are innovative and change some of their practices in delivering that content to users.
Thank you.
Yeah.
John, I heard you are making a revolution with 5 people. And a lot of visibility, and it's amazing what you have done with this idea of preprints. Tell us, how do you think it may contribute to reproducibility?
Well, thanks for the kind remarks. I'm not sure about the revolution, but it's true that after 25 years of preprints in physics and mathematics, preprints seem to be emerging as approaching the mainstream of communication in biomedical sciences and also in other disciplines. I mean, I think in general that this reproducibility is a multifactorial problem, and I would certainly hope that preprints can help, but I certainly don't think that they are the entire solution. But one way in which, a couple of ways in which preprints can help, obviously, is that and I think everybody probably knows here, the concept of a preprint is a manuscript which is complete, but not yet published, and certainly not yet certified by peer review. So in its purest form, a preprint is something that is put on a server like ours, like bioRxiv, which is a process that is free, and then it's freely available to be read by anyone. And there are no barriers to that posting. No novelty is required, no originality, and certainly it is not required that the results reported are positive results. And I think we know that the journal literature tends to be skewed towards the publication of positive results and not negative or neutral results, however you define those things. Preprint services have no such biases, so it is perfectly possible for someone to post a manuscript that says just what you said in your opening remarks. I did this, and I got these results which do not resemble these other results that are in the literature. At that point, several things might happen. Either nothing, the manuscript remains there and is a resource to be consulted by anyone who is surveying the available literature in a given field, or the author may get feedback from the community, and this does happen in quite a substantial amount. That feedback may be public, but more often it's private. And the feedback goes back to the author, questioning things like statistical analysis or the power of a particular study, or even the conclusions that have been drawn from that study. So a dialogue is possible at that point that will, one hopes, eventually improve the manuscript that gets submitted to a journal. Now, I cannot prove that that process improves the manuscript. I cannot prove that it has an impact on what happens to that manuscript when it goes into the process of peer review. But I would love to be able to do that kind of study, and perhaps as the volume grows and experience with preprints grows, then we will be able to do those kinds of analyses. But we can't do that right now. But it cannot be a bad thing for work in process to be shared with the widest possible community including many people who know at least as much about the subject as the authors do, it cannot be a bad thing to share that manuscript at a time when it can still be changed and improved. And that basically is one of the values of a preprint service and how it might do something to assist what you persist in calling the reproducibility crisis, which not everybody would fully
how
agree
would you
with.
call it?
I think it's a reproducibility concern, and quite correctly so. But crisis, I think, is a bit dramatic.
Okay. My drama is based on this gray hair on my head that mostly comes from those experiments that did not work in the lab. Thank you, John. Very exciting development you have there.
Thank you.
Elizabeth, you're one of the few people who took very rigorous study of the reproducibility phenomenon. Tell us about your cancer reproducibility projects, how it works, and what are the challenges?
Yeah, so the Cancer Biology Reproducibility Project is the largest public replication study that's been conducted in biomedical sciences. The project involves taking 50 high-impact published studies in the field of cancer biology and then attempting to independently repeat the key experimental results that were published. And so this involves a series of steps. The first is we selected the studies using a quantitative approach. So they were sampled from the literature based on impact, and then the key experimental results were written up as a registered report. So the registered report format basically involves detailing the full methodology that will be used in the replication studies, including a statistical analysis plan, and then it's actually peer-reviewed at eLife. So we go through this stage prior to the data collection phase. Then data collection is conducted using expert independent labs that already have extensive expertise in the methodologies that are being conducted, and then the data is published as a replication report. So you basically end up with a series of steps of review, but most importantly, there's no bias in the publication of those results because the plan was actually accepted for publication and then all of the data is published at the end, rather than being in a situation where it's very difficult usually to publish failed replications because there's a significant bias in the literature against negative results, but also obviously because of the intertwined nature of the peer review process where there are significant conflicts of interest with peer reviewers who are involved in withholding publications that may go against established results.
So you took 5 studies, right? Previously published studies in big scientific journals and from very good labs. And you were able to reproduce 2 out of 5. So you came up again with a 40% reproducibility, similar to what we got from Amgen and Bayer. What attempts you took to reproduce the 3 remaining studies? Now, first question, was it easy to reproduce those 2 studies that you were able to reproduce?
So I think that, reproducibility is actually a very complicated issue. So I definitely don't think that it's very black and white around like what the challenges are or even really how to interpret replication studies. And so one of the things that's really important about our project is that we're talking about the importance of replication studies because any one-off study is just a one-off. So the original study is just a one-off. The replication study is just a one-off. Neither is by definition correct. It's just a sample. And the more samples you take, the more likely you are to get a true estimate of the real effect size. And so the importance of the project is actually about raising awareness that when we have a one-off study, it's actually not that meaningful. And instead, we should reward not just exploratory research, but also confirmatory research that builds a better understanding of the real effect sizes that we're looking at. And so in terms of our ability to take published studies and how difficult it was to reproduce them, extremely difficult in all regards. And it was difficult because of the way we publish things, which is completely inadequate. So there is never enough information about the methods that are used. I totally agree with you that, you know, what Jove's doing is very important because it's very challenging to know exactly what methods were used. Secondly, there's very rarely all of the raw data associated with the figures that are presented. And I mean that in two ways. One, figures are presented without the actual data sets that underlie them. But more importantly, by far the majority of experiments are never included in publications. So you're actually in a situation where the data sets that are presented are not representative of the data that was actually collected. And this is, I think, what underlies a lot of the challenges of being able to reproduce published results. Assays are not validated properly, so assays are not tested for reproducibility. They're not tested for whether they're appropriate for the actual experimental questions that are being answered. And so when you transfer those to a new facility, they're often not reproducible. And so these are all steps that, you know, there are ways to improve. Another component is just documenting which reagents were used and then being able to access those reagents. So less than 50% of the reagents that were included in the studies that we included in the project had the ability to be uniquely identified. So what that means is that people will just put p53 antibody from cell signaling. Well, there's 10 p53 antibodies from cell signaling, so you're not sure which antibody that is. So that means you have to go back to the original lab in order to obtain that information. When you have to go back to the original lab, you have an enormous amount of data lost very quickly. So the data decay is extremely rapid. The information is lost within a couple of years. So we had less than 60% of the original authors could provide the information that was requested for being able to do the replications. So these are things like really understanding what reagents were used, the raw data that was associated with the figures, the methods that were used. You know, frequently the corresponding author could not provide that information and instead referred to the first author, who was almost universally already gone from the lab. So that in itself is a big challenge. So you're trying to track down people who are no longer even necessarily working as scientists. And so I think that, you know, some of these challenges can just be addressed by having better practices in publishing, where you capture all of this information up front at the time of publication so that you don't have to go back to the original authors. And the Open Science Framework is one way to do that. We used it for the Reproducibility project. It captures all of the information about the replications, including full methodology, all of the raw data, all of the commercial reagents were uniquely identified. All of the non-commercial reagents were stored in repositories, so they're available for anybody who wants to request them.
Did you speak with the original authors of the publications that were not reproduced, and what was their response?
The whole study is based on working with the original authors. So the design of the study actually includes the original authors. They were contacted at the time that the studies were selected. They were actually peer reviewers of the registered report and of the final report. So they were involved in the entire process.
I see. Are they able to reproduce these studies in their own labs now?
I don't know the answer to that question. And I certainly, like I mentioned, don't think that it's black and white in the sense of, you know, the replication study is correct and the original study is wrong. I think it's two independent studies of which you're just presenting data, and I think that the more times you replicate an experiment to look at an effect, the more likely you are to get at a true effect size. So with the replication studies, what we did was actually a meta-analysis of the original experiments plus the replication studies, and combined those two sets of data together to give an estimate based on both studies, rather than, you know, saying one's right and one's wrong. And so that combined analysis is likely a better representation of the true effect size.
Do you feel that if you would try to reproduce the studies again and again and again, 10 times more, eventually maybe one of them would be reproduced?
So I think that it would be really interesting to do multiple replications to look at those questions. One of the things I've found, you know, very interesting about this topic is that despite there being intense interest and enormous amount of press and discussion on this topic, there's actually very few studies that look at the rates of replication. So the only way to look at reproducibility is to do replication studies, because by definition, that's how you can tell if a study is reproducible. Our study is by far the largest study that has been conducted in biomedicine, and it is not funded by the NIH. And so when you ask questions like that, the answer is don't know, because there's no funding to do those studies.
A couple comments on this. So first of all, phenomenon when publishing scientists who publish original study later cannot reproduce study in their own lab oftentimes happens. I observed it with my own eyes. It happens for a few reasons. Practically most often it happens because the original member of the laboratory who did the study left. And they're busy with something else. They cannot come back and to do this experiment, and practically technology is lost. Another thing, oftentimes when you repeat it, try it 100 times more, eventually it will work. So maybe reproducibility crisis is not a reproducibility crisis. Maybe it's a productivity crisis, right? We just don't know to preserve that knowledge in terms of data, in terms of method, and transfer it, or even preserve it in this specific lab who originally did it. And so it quickly gets lost, and as a result, we have to do it again and again and again to reach the same answer. Yeah, so
I think related to that. So the transferability question is something that comes up a lot, and I think that if you look at academia and published studies, the transferability is very difficult. That comes down to assay validation. So if you look in industry, you very frequently transfer assays. It's routine. People transfer assays every day. They design an assay, they validate it, they transfer it to a CRO, and it's run there. And they have about an 80% success rate of transferring their assays without having to do any additional optimization. That is because their assays are actually validated internally, and the reproducibility of them is assessed. Versus in academia, we tend to take a model that's just been run in our lab. Oh, I'm going to use that model. We don't necessarily check whether that model is reproducible. We don't necessarily include the correct controls, positive and negative controls, to look at whether the model continues to maintain stability over time, what the variability is of that assay over time. We don't store the data and go back and check whether any of those parameters have shifted. And this is, I think, a big component of what underlies these issues with being able to replicate experiments in new labs. And that replication issue is not related to just reproducibility, it's definitely also related to productivity, because then you can't just build on a published result. So it's not just, okay, is that original result reproducible? It's also how easy is it for us to take these published results and then make that next advancement.
I see. I'd like to turn to all the people here in this room. Any one of you here affected by reproducibility issues through your work in the lab or as a publisher or librarian? Anyone knew about it before they came to the room? Very good. Question to, so we heard a few components of this story, right? And a few different approaches to do this thing. What do you think would be a solution or a technology where we should all start from to address this problem? If we lived in the ideal world, and let's forget about money and required investment and so on, but just purely look at the problem, say, okay, this is the problem we have, assume we have all the money and time in the world, we want to solve it perfectly, where we would start? Elizabeth.
So what I would love to see, with the parameters you've given, which is that the whole world and resources are open to you, is a data sharing catalog similar to PubMed Central for articles, but a catalog of data Data is hard to get at, and this isn't going to completely solve the problem, of course, but it's hard to get at sometimes because it's in silos, and there's so many different technologies and products out there to curate it and host it and archive it. But you know, a Google search isn't going to bring up everything you need. So having something like an indexed catalog a la PubMed Central, but just for data, I think would be a really terrific resource for researchers to find data that they can then use to reproduce in experiments.
Do you see any enforcement mechanism to ensure that?
The federal government, which, I don't know, the landscape of the federal government these days might not be such that it would support an endeavor of that scope and nature, but there are some libraries now that are doing it on a more local level. So NYU has a data catalog for their researchers, and they're trying to build something a little more regional. So I know they're engaging with the University of Maryland, Baltimore, which is, you know, high-end research producing university, and some others in the area to kind of formalize something that they can all buy into. The delivery of a catalog of that nature will be years away, and it'll be scoped smaller than what I would like to see, which is really an international system of cataloging the data.
Well, one enforcement mechanism I experienced when I was working in the lab, it's when I tried to publish a paper, and paper was accepted. It was at PNAS. And then when it was finalized, the PNAS required me to resubmit the data, the sequence data at that time, according to specific NCBI government specifications, right? Mm-hmm. So I did it once. Well, they still didn't like it format. Then they told me to do it. And because I was very motivated to publish this paper, I would do everything to publish that paper. So obviously, I resubmitted my data in correct format. So maybe it's publishers who should enforce that, and they can.
Yeah.
They can, because they have that bottleneck under their control of publication.
That's a great idea. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. John, what are your thoughts? What is the solution?
Well, I think the data warehousing idea is, I certainly think that's an interesting one, and I think the newly appointed, or relatively newly appointed, director of the National Library of Medicine said that she was willing to support such an effort just a couple of weeks ago. Is that right?
Yes, Patty Brennan, who is an informationist and nurse and is now leading the National Library of Medicine, has addressed that issue, and I believe her hope is to start incorporating data sets into PubMed Central.
Yeah. Just to continue that idea, I mean, it's certainly possible that journals can have policies that require data deposition, and many journals do, and many of those policies are getting more extensive and possibly even, you might say, draconian. They certainly are requiring much more work at an editorial level to make sure that papers conform to those requirements. So those standards are necessary and should be enforced at the journal level. The question, another level of enforcement, of course, is through funders, and funders have done much to impose their wills on scientists in the last few years, particularly in relation to publication, and could do much the same with data management. Just continuing the thought about data and access to it, Elizabeth referred to how useful it would be if, in addition to having a figure in a paper, you could have access to the underlying data set that gave rise to that figure. And that technology is with us. It's not well developed yet, but it is being developed. I can see a time coming very quickly when that will become a standard part of publication.
So, how to say it softly? I disagree. I disagree because I think we have a lot of situations today where we have studies with one data point, as I showed you before, where you have very clear, you don't need more data. This is the result. Your mouse dies or doesn't die. right? Or your cell gets signal or doesn't get signal. You don't need more data for that, and we still cannot reproduce the studies. So I think even, do we need data preservation? Yes. For many different reasons, we need data preservation. For productivity, for everything else. But even if we solve this problem 100%, and tomorrow all the data preserved in the most perfect format, I think that the reproducibility problem will still be there.
I don't disagree with that. As I said at the beginning, I think it's a multifactorial problem, and data is only one part of it. But again, it cannot be a bad thing for data to be data sets to be publicly available. And I mean, we had on bioRxiv, we had a perfect use case actually for a preprint service just very recently, when a publicly available data set on autism genes that had been published in a prominent journal by a very prominent and distinguished group was reanalyzed by another prominent and distinguished group to find that the conclusions were completely different. And graciously, the first group publicly acknowledged the fact that they basically screwed up their statistics. So there was a great example of how, you know, if you have access to the data, you can look at it and see what you find. So, I mean, I'm not saying that it solves everything by any means, but I think it's one contributory factor. And these source data, the source data project is the one I'm thinking of, which is actually being pioneered by the European Molecular Biology Organization. They are the ones who I think will bring this technology to the rest of us for publication purposes.
Your peaceful response deprived me of chance of battle data versus methods that I hoped for. All right, Elizabeth, you mentioned needing replication studies, but we have about 2 million articles published every year. Mm-hmm. And even if this amount was tenfold less, it is very difficult to imagine a replication study for each of it. It's practically impossible. What do you think about it? How we should take it?
Yeah, I totally agree. It's impossible to replicate everything. So I think about it as, you know, most articles are never even cited, so their value and impact on the world is questionable anyway. And I think that it's very clear that there's articles that are published that are of great interest, that have enormous potential impact, and that our measures of defining whether they are impactful and high quality are currently flawed because the measures that we have don't assess reproducibility. So those articles that we selected were all based on number of citations, so by, you know, the most currently used standard for potential impact. And the studies that Bayer and Amgen published had no correlation between number of citations and whether they could reproduce the results of them. So I think that it's very important that we do replication studies for potentially impactful work, because what happens otherwise is that people end up wasting an enormous amount of time and resources, and they attempt to do replications in an ad hoc manner across the world, both in academic labs but also in industry labs, and then they fail to publish those. So there's actually surveys done where they looked at people's experiences of being impacted by irreproducibility. And in those surveys, more than half of people, scientists, say, yes, I have experienced an inability to replicate published results. What I thought was most interesting about that was that when they asked them, did you publish that experience, less than 30% said yes. And that reason is twofold. One is culture. We don't have a culture where it's acceptable to publish replications, particularly failed replications. But then secondly, it's because if you do not design a replication study formally, it's actually very difficult to interpret a failed replication. You're not really sure, did I just do it wrong? Did I include the right controls? Did I power my study well enough? There's actually a lot of questions around, you know, how to actually interpret that result. And so frequently what people do is they just move on. They're like, oh, I couldn't get it to work, so I'm just going to move on, and they don't publish that, and then, you know, 20 other people or 1,000 other people all waste years trying to build on that result. So that's why I think it's very important to actually fund confirmatory studies for the most impactful work.
Understood. So here you heard a few potential solutions that we named here. One is data preservation, another one better publishing of methods, and then Elizabeth with two ideas of replication studies for the most important studies, and then changing incentives for publication of negative results or neutral results. Now I would like to open questions for audience. Please ask us questions or tell us your opinion.
This is a question from Duke University Press, who's attending virtually, and it's for Beth Ketterman. They want to know if videos are considered as, are counting as a publication, or is it part of the manuscript or article?
So I'm assuming you're talking about the tenure process, if they sort of count for that process, and you know, it's so dependent upon the unit or department or college that's going through that process as to whether or not they accept from certain publications. My hope is that the video content you see in a peer-reviewed publication like Jove would definitely be counted, because not only is it more descriptive in that you're seeing the video experiment as it happens with the original researcher, but you're also getting the methods in written form. So it's gone through a rigorous peer review both in video and written format. So I can't, you know, make a blanket statement that it every time is going to be considered acceptable for that process, but I would like to hope that it would be. And Jove's impact factor is great and improving. So I would see that if it is not recognized currently by those colleges or departments now, that it will be in the future.
Maybe to add a few words to that, video publication can be can act as a regular scientific journal, and this is what we do in Jove, right? So it does have impact factor, it's indexed in Medline, PubMed, editorial board, so on. We see researchers publish there, researchers put it on their CV, researchers include it in their grant application, and I know that some of them publish it toward their tenure and other considerations. So by now, I would say after 10 years, I can clearly say that Jove works as another publication. Did we become nature or science of this world, right? The leaders where publishing for an author means practically a career? Not yet, but we are trying. Any other questions? How much time do we have?
I make it 11:45 now.
All right. So, yes, question?
Yeah. So Elizabeth mentioned about citations, and I manage an online publishing platform, so we're at the end of the chain. So we're really not going to establish changes to the research process, but a big feature is showing how many citing articles there are. And you just mentioned that that seems to have no correlation to reproducibility. But I wonder if we could manage to get quality of citation in there. And if the citations were marked as refuting or affirming or extending or something, if we could manage that system of that, would that change the way people thought about getting their data and reproducibility done just by having that end result change their perception?
Yeah, I don't think anybody's done that actual analysis of really digging out the citations and seeing, you know, what is the quality or whether they're refuting or supportive. Although I would say that given that most studies are cited by either their own selves or by collaborators, and very rarely are there failed replications published, so you're unlikely to actually have citations that are refuting the original work. So I think the vast majority of them would be, you know, supportive anyway. And I also would say that, you know, all of these are just kind of hypothetical based on very small data sets, because like I mentioned, we basically have no data sets to know what is associated with reproducibility anyway, because we have so few studies that have been done.
Could I just add one more to that? I meant to say earlier that on bioRxiv we allow the author to label her manuscript as new results, confirmatory results, or contradictory results. So in 11,200 manuscripts, there are only 2% that are confirmatory and 1% that is contradictory. I'm personally very disappointed about that, somewhat surprised, but maybe not terribly, because, and again, Elizabeth has referred to this, that we don't have a research culture that incentivizes people to write up the results of experiments that don't produce positive results. It's regarded as a waste of time, lack of productivity, not a good use of resources, and so on. And plus, people are not very keen to show off things that don't work. I mean, scientists are human beings too. So we feel that we should do more with bioRxiv to promote the availability of this channel for this kind of reporting, and hopefully some other changes can take place in the research community to add to those incentives. But just to, sorry to rabbit on here, but to your point about citations and citation practice, I think another consequence of the emergence of preprints in scholarly work is that people are now paying more attention to what goes into the citation list. And people want, for example, a preprint to be called out in the citation list because they want to make sure that people understand the nature of this reference. And that's led to further conversations about identifying citations as supporting or contradictory. And there may well be changes along those lines in the publishing industry as a whole.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
I'm Mark Johnson from Public Library of Science. Great panel. Thank you very much for presenting. So at PLOS, we do a couple of things. We have an open data policy, so authors have to agree to make their data available as part of publishing with all of the journals. And PLOS has recently started a partnership with Protocols.io, which allows authors to get a DOI for their detailed protocols that then is connected back to the research article. And I wanted to ask if Beth or Elizabeth had any kind of experience or feedback on that type of connection of open data and protocols back to the research articles. Thank you.
Do you want to go ahead, Beth?
Well, I would say that linked data in general is something that libraries are on the cusp of adopting through our systems of discovery and our catalogs and our discovery tools. So any innovative way, like what you've just described, to ensure that if we're describing something in our catalog, it can be pointed to, and then additional content can be pointed to, is going to be critical to the success of the discovery of that information. I can't say I've had any direct feedback from users on that yet, but I mean, I think that's coming, and part of what we're building as a profession is infrastructure to support the discovery of that kind of linked data, that kind of system.
Yeah, I think that's great. Like, I think having that information linked would, make it much easier for people, like Beth mentioned, to discover it and make use of it, right? So I think that should be, something that more and more journals adopt over time. I think one thing that is a little challenging is if you just make it a requirement that upon request people have to share information, then that's still that issue of decay where if you have to go back to the original lab, then frequently they won't have it anymore, or they won't know where it is because the author has left. And so there, if you, instead of saying you have to share it upon request, which is pretty much the common practice for reagents and data at the moment in most journals, instead having it in that repository is much better.
All right, I think it's time for us to finish, and I want to just tell you that I bet in 5 years again we will have a session here devoted to reproducibility of science. I think this is a very complex problem, basically overlapping with every aspect of scientific publishing, library life, and it relates to technical scientific stuff, business considerations, culture, and so on. I bet it's not going to be solved soon, but we have to work on it because it's a really, really big problem, and advancement of science is simply not possible without solving it. Thank you very much for coming.